Hi again then guys, and welcome to another Special Projects custom build. And as with some of the other builds that we've done before, this is to some degree inspired by some real vehicles, but not necessarily based on them. So you don't need to worry about adhering to real life numbers, and as such you can adjust the car to personal preference, or if you want to race it at a specific power or PP level, etc. Now, this particular car is of course the Lotus Carlton, and there are touring car versions of the Carlton, the Vauxhall version in particular, and it's a perfect candidate for being turned into a touring car. Now, the specs on this model are to some degree similar to a DTM car. Not as far as weight though, of course, because we can't make it anywhere near as light as those vehicles, but as far as the visuals, I've opted for the black 6-spoke rims. I can't remember exactly what they're called at the moment, but they're right down at the bottom of the selection. I opted for inch up 1, and they come in a really nice solid black anyway, so you don't really need to paint them. As far as the body, I've gone for Scotia White, which is probably my most commonly used white. It comes from Mitsubishi. It's a very clean, old school looking white, and that's it for the visuals. It's not a premium, of course, so you don't get interesting looking body kits or wings. And so we'll go first of all, of course, to the mechanical setup, and then, as we always do, take it out to a racetrack to see if it can actually pull off being a convincing touring car. Now, the Carlton is a little bit bigger than many of the other touring cars that are on the game, especially in terms of length. It is a pretty big vehicle, but it still handles itself very well, I would say, as a touring car. As you can see, it's running at a pretty reasonable PP. It's not overly high, 525. The power is a little bit more than an unmodified DTM car, and the weight, as I said, is quite a bit higher than those vehicles, around 300 kilos more, and unfortunately there's nothing we can do about that. Now, I've gone for racing hard tyres. Of course, racing softs would be even quicker, but people seem to be a bit opposed to those for whatever reason. As far as suspension, we've got the ride height as low as possible on this particular car. Springs I've increased to 1575 and 1050. The dampers on 5, anti-roll a little higher than some of these other builds, also on 5, to really give it that stiff race car feel. We've got neutral camber and tow, perhaps surprisingly for a race car, but the reason for that is because it just doesn't need it. The handling is already good enough, but feel free to change it if you so desire. As far as the diff in particular, I've opted for halfway on initial torque, as low as possible on acceleration and braking. But again, feel free to play around with different settings, find out what works best for you. And also, incidentally, the Carlton is a car which is very responsive to diff tuning. If you change these settings, it makes a drastic difference to how the car will corner. You can make it much more slippery and tail happy. If you increase the initial torque, for instance, up to 60 instead of 30, that's a perfect example of the kind of difference you can expect. Now, as far as the power, we do have an oil change, so you need to bear that in mind for the PP. I've gone for the sports exhaust and the high RPM turbo. And as far as weight, very simple, just the full weight loss package. You can't adjust the downforce unless you change the wing, and personally I just don't like the look of the wings when you change them. But again, that's down to personal preference. As far as the gearbox, of course it's more of a track build than a straight line machine, so we've gone for a shorter ratio gearbox than the original, with an auto setting, as you can see, of 180, then individual gears of 3.2, 2.2, 1625, 1250, 1 and 850 with a final drive of 3. And of course you could adjust the final drive or the gears as necessary if you need a bit more top end performance or maybe a bit better acceleration, for instance. So it can go either way. But that's it for the tune. Now let's take it out to a racetrack. Now, to give you some idea of what you can expect from this car and from this tune, the handling is a little heavy, to be honest. Even with the settings that I'm using, it is heavier than many of the other cars that we've built, race cars and road cars, which is why I wanted to highlight the fact that the differential makes a big difference, because I know many of you guys don't like understeer, whereas I do. I prefer cars that are heavy rather than cars that are constantly just spinning the tyres. Now, if you want to change that, because some people prefer oversteer, like a TVR or a Corvette, that kind of handling, then, as I said, increase in particular that initial torque, and it will make a big difference in that regard. If though you're more like me and you like the cars to be a bit stiffer and you can wrestle with them more, then just go with the settings that I've opted for. Overall, it's a quick car, not necessarily DTM quick of course, which is reflected by the lower PP, but still, if you do decide to use it for racing or for seasonals, obviously I hope you find it fun and competitive as well. And if you'd like to keep up with other special projects builds like this one, customs, or also replicas, then of course you could subscribe down below, or if you'd like to check out the ones which we've already done, and there really are a lot of them, you can check out the playlist at the end of this video. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.